You can begin, Dr. Mohan.
I am Rakesh Mohan, President and Distinguished Fellow of the Center for Social and Economic Progress in New Delhi. We are delighted to have the opportunity to hold the first launch of the book, The Struggle and the Promise, Restoring India's Potential by Naushad Forbes. This is in fact CSEP's 14th flagship seminar, which we hold for rare events like this. This is an incredible book written by Naushad, basically wanting to address the potential of India to lead the world, in taking into account its many, many strengths, particularly this diverse culture with something for everyone, a young population that is thirsty for education and achievement, and a strong and diverse private sector. I won't say more on the book because that's Naushad's job. I just want to say that this is a really delightful book to read, easy to read, and it is incredible that someone like Naushad, who is active, hands-on businessman, who runs a company, who has been president of CII, and is participates in a whole number of TV appearances, writes op-eds and so on. How he can write such a book is beyond my understanding. Obviously, doesn't sleep. Let me introduce him more formally. Naushad is the co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation firm. He is also chairman of the Ananta Aspen Center and also chairman of the Center for Technology, Innovation and Economic Research. He was the president, as I said, of the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, in 2016-17. He's on the board of several educational institutions and public companies. He's also a visiting lecturer and consulting professor at Stanford University for courses on technology in newly industrializing countries. Naushad received his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from Stanford University. He didn't really want to leave there, but had to be pushed out to come back to India, and also pulled by his family, of course. I have had the privilege of knowing Naushad since around the late 1990s, when I first actually met him in the first India-Stanford conference. And it's always been a delight to meet him, to discuss, and of course, we've been friends ever since. What I will do is, after I request Naushad to talk about his book, I will then ask in this order of the panelists for their comments. First, Kiran Muzumdar-Shaw, second, Arvind Panagaria, and third, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And I will introduce each of the panelists just before I ask them to speak. And they will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes. Naushad?
Thank you, Rakesh. Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this program. And I'd also like to join you in thanking Kiran, Montek, and Arvind for joining us today. I think both Kiran and Montek and Arvind had to change schedules and so on. Appreciate that very much. And Arvind, I know it's 7:30 in the morning, so particularly appreciate you joining us at this time. I'm not going to try to summarize the book. What I'm going to try to do is to talk about a few themes that run through the book. Obviously, the big theme is India is a country of great promise. And my starting point really is that the world wants India to succeed. And the world wants India to succeed. And this comes across in a whole range of incidents that I talk about in the report in the book. But many experiences. I was talking to a friend the other day, and he was telling me about Goh Chok Tong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, when he was Prime Minister of Singapore, saying this in 1991 in so many words: the world wants India to succeed. The US trade representative, when a group of us from CI had gone to see him in 2016, right after he gave us a very irritated comment because India had just blocked an agreement at the WTO. He then also told us how much he wanted India to succeed. And we got this message again and again on CI delegations that we took to countries all over the place, to Iran, to Vietnam, to Sri Lanka, to Bhutan, to Indonesia. And the message was always that, look, India is welcome, Indian industry is welcome, and not only welcome, but it's actively desired. We are seen as a benign presence. We are seen as a benign force, something that adds to the country and is a force for good. Having said that, I think one of the points that I always make when I talk about India with investors overseas, for example, is that India is a long-term play. Do not come to India for short-run results and for short-run profit. And in the same spirit, in that spirit of us being a long-term play, this is not a book about quick fixes. This is a book about how we get to leadership. It's a 20 or 30-year project, and it requires many changes. It requires a lot of people coming together. It requires a lot of change, and I'll talk about 3 big areas. But more than anything else, we have that opportunity, we have that promise and potential, and we should take advantage of it. So if you like, three key things that I'd like to talk about. First, I think we have to expect a lot more from Indian industry if we wish to have any claim for world leadership. Second, we have to get the balance right between government policy and our institutions and culture. And third, the quality of our democracy matters. The norms of being a liberal democracy are important for us to deliver on this promise of leadership. Norms like authenticity and humility and nuance and qualification are important to deliver on this ambition of leadership. So let me start with industry, because I feel I can talk more directly of my demands for industry. And if you like, my demands for industry are 4 I's. The first I is inclusiveness. Inclusiveness in growth by investing our CSR funds very specifically in primary education outcomes, so that we include more and more of our population in our growth, progress, development. Second, this will please Arvind particularly, investment in labor-intensive industry as a way of including people and creating good quality jobs to a much greater extent than we do. And third, by a new social contract that provides a minimum protection for all labor, whether that labor is formally employed in our companies or informally employed through contractors. So that's being more inclusive. Second is to be more international, to be open to the world in India and to be open to the world by investing overseas. I won't say any more about this because this is a subject not only which Arvind will speak on, but which I've learned from Arvind. So I think he should talk about it because it's what I look to him for his input on this. Third is to be more innovative. Innovation in developing countries has been my academic field. So I feel I can speak with some more authority in this area. And investment in in-house R&D is something I argue quite strongly for in chapter 5 in the book. In brief, India invests 0.3% of GDP in in-house R&D. The world average is 1.5%. So that's also the number for China. So we need in Indian industry to scale our investments in in-house R&D by a factor of 5 to match the world average or to match China. That's the requirement that we have. We have a huge opportunity in the availability of talent, relatively low-cost talent in our engineers. The world sees that, world industry sees that, Indian industry needs to see it too. And I hope Kiran will speak to this because Kiran's company has been doing this in a way that should inspire us all in Indian industry. Fourth is that Indian industry needs to be more independent. Until 1991, Indian industry was very dependent on the government for licenses, for a whole bunch of other things. Since then, things have opened up so dramatically, but the mindset is still, to a large extent, one of dependence. It's still one of going to the government and asking for things. And I think Indian industry has to stop asking the government for things. My metric of Indian industry being independent is, if I can use a quote from the book, an industrialist criticizing the government should not make the headlines. Today, if an industrialist even slightly criticizes the government, it makes the headlines. It shouldn't. That must be a basic feature of an independent private sector. It should be so normal for the way in which we operate that it no longer is news. The second area is the role of the state, and especially its interplay with our unique and diverse culture and the quality of our institutions. My argument here is that we start with India having low state capacity. This is not unique or a new argument by any means. Many have argued exactly that. And there are lots of examples in the book that also talk about this low state capacity. But this low state capacity combines with another feature, which is that our diversity and our pluralism means that any close state government relationship is automatically somewhat suspect. We've recently seen the privatization of Air India. If Air India had been a profit-making undertaking, there would have been all manner of allegations floating around about the deal and why it had been done. The fact that it was losing 20 crores a day was highly beneficial to the criticism being really muted. And second, the fact also that it went to the Tatas, who are seen as being such a principled industrial house, also led to the whole deal being seen as much more muted. Just think, if Air India, in its form of a 20 crore loss-making company each day, had gone to take the obvious examples, had gone to either the Ambanis or the Adanis, what would we have heard in our public discourse? When these two combine together, low state capacity plus a suspicion of any close industry-state relationship, it seems to me that for the state has to play an essential role, but it has to play an extremely limited role. And unless we approach all policy making with this frame, with this mindset, I think we will struggle. We have to constantly find ways in which the state can limit its role. The state can play a smaller role and enable industry, enable NGOs, etc., to perform and function instead of trying to decide things and play its role itself. And I talk about some examples, particularly with regard to the higher education sector and public research to illustrate this. So for example, for public research, the argument that I make is that the government has to fund public R&D, but it shouldn't do it. Today, the government funds and does. It funds public R&D about the same proportion as countries worldwide. So there's not a gap in funding, but it does it itself in autonomous, independent government R&D laboratories. Instead of that, the government should fund the R&D, but it should do scientific research in the higher education sector, and it should do technological research in industry. That's why the recent budget announcement was so welcome, where 25% of the defense R&D budget is now open for funding both industry and higher education. It's a small step, but it's a very important change in direction, and I think could be fundamentally transformative to our innovation system if it is implemented effectively. Finally, let me talk about the quality of our democracy. The norms of being a liberal democracy, if you like. They're words like authenticity, humility, nuance. These are the words that I think need to characterize how we do things in the country. I've never expected perfection in how we govern and what we do, but I do expect honesty. I think that's an essential need in being an effective, good quality, high norm liberal democracy. And the essential need for honesty, it seems to me, is dissent. is argument, it's disagreeing. In a chapter in the book, towards the end of the book on culture, I talk about one of my 5 favorite books, which is a book by the social scientist Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And Hirschman argues that you respond to a decline in a state or an institution or a company in one of 2 ways. You either complain, you use the voice option, or you exit, you stop buying the service, or you emigrate, or you no longer draw on the institution. Whether you choose voice or exit, because it's much healthier and much better if you choose voice instead of exit, whether you choose voice or exit depends on loyalty. And loyalty depends on trust. Do you trust the state or the company or the institution to actually do what's best for you? And if you do trust it, then you will choose voice, you will choose dissent, you will choose an argument instead of choosing the exit option. So ultimately, this book is an argument, I think, for active engagement. It's an argument for understanding. It's an argument for discussion about these kinds of, I think, key issues that would concern India's potential. And I really look forward to today's discussion being in that same spirit of discussion and dissent and argument, because that's so much a part of what we are and so much a part of what being a high norm liberal democracy is all about. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naushad. I think that you have really encapsulated the key points in your book so well in such a short period. And you're, of course, exercising your voice and dissent with a spirit of loyalty to the country. It really is a miracle in a sense that Naushad always speaks his voice, provides dissent, both in terms of not hesitating to criticize the government on key policy issues, and also differing with his industry colleagues on many of the things that they would like to say. And it's the quality of his very, very, what I might call civilized way of discussing and dissenting and exercising his voice, that despite these views, he was indeed elected as president of CII and is called for discussions almost in every forum. Thank you very much, Naushad. So let me now introduce our first panelist, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw. She is the founder and executive chairman of Biocon Limited and Biocon Biologies Limited. Among her key achievements, of course, is that she's a board member of CSEP. We are very lucky to have her as our board member, and she brings a lot of wisdom to our board. Ms. Shaw has been named among Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. She has been pivotal in redefining the biotechnology landscape and ensuring affordable access to life-saving biopharmaceuticals globally. She received the Padma Bhushan in 2005 for efforts in industrial biotechnology and the Padma Shri much earlier in 1989. She holds a bachelor's degree in zoology, of all things, from Bangalore University in India, and is qualified as a master brewer in Ballarat University, Australia. So her first intention was to actually become a brewer. So she has indeed come a long way from the brewing industry to biotechnology. She has received many honorary doctorates in recognition of her preeminent contributions to the field of biotechnology. We have known each other for almost 20 years. She was also generous enough to write a chapter on her work in the book on India Transformed some years back, edited by me. So Kiran, you have been among the leading innovators in Indian industry. One of the striking features of the book, as Naushad just mentioned, is the attention that it gives to the role of technology, innovation, design, and R&D, or lack of it, mostly on lack of it in Indian industry. Naushad has documented, and which he just mentioned, on how low our R&D investment is in India, in both the public and private sectors, and particularly in contrast with China and Korea. I have been puzzled myself in that We used to think before 1991 that because we were a closed economy, there wasn't any competition, therefore there was no incentive to do R&D. But even after opening of the economy and competition in general, both domestic and foreign, there hasn't been almost any change in the amount of money, the resources as a proportion of GDP going to R&D in Indian industry. And one sees very, very few products being developed except in your sector and, of course, in pharmaceuticals. So I would appreciate your views on why this has happened, why this is happening, and can we be more optimistic in this area in the future?
So Rakesh, thanks a lot. And let me first start by commending Naushad on a wonderfully written book. I mean, Naushad is a very meticulous researcher and a very thoughtful, interpreter of, various aspects of the economy, of democracy, and all these things that sort of basically fit in together to make this whole socio-economic milieu. And let me also tell you that, whilst I've sort of gone through most of the book, I particularly spent a lot of time on these chapters on innovation and research. And it was very, deftly handled, very wonderfully researched. And let me start by saying, Rakesh, that, for me as an entrepreneur who was driven by science, who was determined to start a research-led company, I know how important R&D is to create value. I think that is the fundamental premise on which you need to drive innovation and research, because if you want non-linear growth, you have to basically start innovating. India actually, as Naushad said, is sort of one of the lowest investors when it comes to R&D investments. He talked about private enterprise investing only 0.3% of the GDP. But even if you look at it at a national level, it's 0.7%. And when you compare this to most of the other economies that are, very innovative economies, even if you look at the US or China, these are all countries that are actually investing upwards of 2% of their GDP in R&D. If you look at some of the other countries in the Asian region who are really, really focusing on innovation big time, is Korea and Taiwan, who are investing 4.8% of GDP and 3.3% of GDP. So we do need to double our spend in R&D. But even when you think about that, you also have to look at another bit of statistics that Naushad has dwelled upon, which I thought was very revealing. If you look at how R&D investments are actually deployed across sectors, if you look at US roughly spends about $600 billion on R&D per annum. And that is kind of split roughly about 70% within industry, 20%, at universities, and the rest is spent actually in what they call as publicly funded institutes. Now, if you compare that to India, which spends $18 billion per annum, which is the 0.7% of GDP that I talked about, that is actually spread between the private sector at 35%. So we are half of what other countries do. Universities, we only spend 10%, which is again half of what most other countries do. And as Naushad very rightly said, this whole notion of publicly funded research, which is in their own publicly funded institutes, is 55%. So 55% of that $18 billion is really being, plowed into the university, into the public institutes, which are, like DRDO and, all the kind of government research institutes. And, universities get very little. Now, to create an innovation ecosystem, you actually need universities coming up with ideas and patented ideas which then get basically, absorbed by industry to build on and, create that value. And you have this whole virtuous ecosystem being created with funding and valuations. And that is not happening. If I look at my own pharmaceutical industry, which you mentioned, that invests a lot more in R&D than other sectors, that's a fact. But at the same time, I think we must understand that the kind of R&D most Indian pharmaceutical companies, indulge in is very imitative R&D, something which we call reverse engineering. So whilst we basically account for 30% of the global market share of generic molecules by volume, we only account for 4% by value. And that's where I think we have to change the game, because we do need to, innovate. We do need to research and come up with new molecules. I mean, that is not happening. And I think that's where India is now kind of venturing into, where I think Indian companies want to now invest in what we call as new chemical entities or new biological entities. And that's a very, very high risk, high reward game. It's also a very long gestational, sort of model, because the payback takes a very long time and the risk of failure is very high. And therefore, you don't see that kind of money coming into into this space. And I really believe that we need to incentivize this much broken industry academia link. It was there many, many moons ago, but in the last several decades, it's simply not there. We need to make that link happen. And the only way I see that happening is by incentivizing the industry academia linkage, where you basically lure industry into investing in academic research, which I think can happen. I think we do have the talent, we have the scientific talent, we have the engineering talent for technology, but I think we need to really do a much better job of innovation. I think everyone knows that it's really about the idea and the value of that idea. How do you create an idea and know the worth of that idea? And how do you keep building value to take it to the market? That is the innovation journey that we all have to really understand, which I think the rest of the developed world does very well, and we need to get there. So that is one aspect of research and innovation that I think we really need to focus on. It starts with patenting. I always tell academic institutes, when you're doing research, please try and look at what you're doing in terms of patentability. And most people lose track of that because, I remember a long time ago when, Ramesh Mashelkar used to be the head of CSIR. He used to always talk about patent literacy and patent operation, those kind of, thinking he had come out with. And he was very right, because you have to patent to create that value around that idea. And once you do that, I think we also need tech transfer offices within our academic centers to shape that idea and to basically make it into a marketable idea, which will be licensed by the companies to take to the market. That is what is missing at the moment in India, and we must do that. And that is something which needs to be focused on and incentivized. The other thing I found very fascinating in Naushad's book was this whole concept of design. I think in manufacturing, design is a very critical and key element of the value of the idea. We are very used to just being very functional as a country. We've always been a very under-resourced country, and we always think of any innovation as something that's great as long as it functions. But that's not good enough. You've got to design it. You've got to design that product. So productizing through design is such an important part of innovation. And I think that's something which we really need to learn. And as Naushad very rightly calls this whole process of research and innovation, it's really about building a learning culture and a learning organization to be able to do all of these things. So I, for one, believe that if you want to really break away from this status quo and steady state growth, you will have to, innovate and start building non-linear growth through new products, new ideas. And it's happening, Rakesh. I just want to tell you that right now in Bangalore, I'm really excited that we have this boom of startups. And, the startups are very exciting because they are coming up with new ideas. I, for one, have always believed that in the next 10 years, India can become the largest digital and digitally enabled marketplace in the world. Just think of our demographics, our population size, and the demand for, digital kind of, products. I think that's what is really sort of making it very exciting. And if you create the world's largest marketplace, everything will happen in a way that India then becomes the focus. Today, we are forced to look at marketplaces that are attractive and large, which don't exist in India. We've got to start creating those marketplaces. And I think a digital marketplace is what appeals, at least to me, as someone in this whole area of technology, as the way to move forward in leadership. And for that to happen, you've got to innovate. You've got to come up with new ideas, new products, new digital technologies. And it is happening as we speak. We have in Bangalore got what they call as a large number of unicorns, which are these billion-dollar value companies that have been created out of just few digital ideas. And I think they're very exciting companies. They've found a niche, they've created a market opportunity, and they're growing. If you think about, the fact that there's so much venture money chasing those ideas, that's also an exciting thought because it tells you that these are being looked at as innovative ideas. Some of them may be Me Too ideas. In fact, most of them might be Me Too ideas. But what they're trying to do is to create new platforms. They're trying to see whether they can, improve or adapt these platforms to what they believe is a very different marketplace. So I think I, for one, feel very optimistic that innovation is happening, will happen. We need to really seriously focus on incentivizing innovation. In fact, I did suggest to the government that just as they've come up with production-linked incentives, they need to come up with research-linked incentives. And the objectives of that research-linked incentives must be about certain moonshot areas, must be about the industry academia linkages, and must be about creating value and wealth from innovation. So I think I'm going to sort of stop my comments there, Rakesh, because I'm sure the other panelists would also like to say their piece on other topics, but I'm sure we can discuss this in the sort of breakout question and answer session. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kiran, for those very, very thoughtful comments and very much focused on the book. If I can just press you for a minute, we don't have too much time, that you've talked about getting incentives from the government, etc. But you didn't talk about why are your business colleagues not like you in terms of investing much more in R&D and innovation. If you take more successful sectors like the automotives as well as also actually IT, apart from all the new digital startups, that largest IT firms, if you compare them with their counterparts elsewhere, they spend very little on R&D, and nor does a whole automotive sector. Almost every component that you use in the automotive sector has basically been imported from abroad in terms of design and everything else. Why is there not an incentive, exactly as you said, to bring new ideas and make money out of them?
Well, Rakesh, let's be honest. I mean, our software services companies are doing extremely well and exceedingly well because it's a huge business opportunity. And this opportunity is only growing. In fact, COVID has made this huge digital transformation as a kind of a must-have for every industry. So the need for supporting digital transformation with digital services is so huge that I don't think they need to innovate products. It'll take a different type of company to innovate products, and that's what I'm hoping will happen, because you are beginning to see, SaaS companies. You are beginning to see some of these companies who are trying to productize and develop products. I know that, fintech products are being developed by the tech industry. In Infosys, on whose board I serve, Finacle was one such product, which actually has been very successful for Infosys. Yeah. But it took a long time for Finacle to really pay back. So I think they believe that they're not as good as innovating in products as they are in offering services. And if the service opportunity is so huge, then why would you want to invest risk money and into innovation, which is a long payback? So those are some of the questions we need to ask ourselves. So there must be a compelling need to innovate. And I feel that compelling need to innovate is in the pharmaceutical industry. Even if you look at, say, the automobile industry, I think if you look at the market opportunity for automobiles in India is so enormous. For a country of our size, we are only marketing something like 40 to 50 million automobiles, which is ridiculous. I mean, we need to be, the market is there to, if you go by the kind of ratios that you see in the developed world, you should be able to market 1 billion vehicles. But we are nowhere near that. So till you satiate the market with what it needs as just basic product, why would you innovate? That's the question. In most of the saturated markets, to differentiate and to, break the mold, you have to innovate to kind of, show growth. Here, we have to just keep producing more to show growth. So I think that is where I find the psyche has to change. And the psyche will only change when there's a compelling need. We have the talent, we have the skills. In fact, I think in Naushad's article, he actually talked about the fact that when it comes to high skills, India has it. The way we've built many of these sectors is because of those high skills. We have highly skilled workforces. But the point is, we are pursuing imitative research or imitative innovation or just imitation all the way through because the demand is so huge. So we don't at this point in time need to differentiate, but there will come a time when we will want to differentiate, and it's already showing, because the value differentiation is what will actually get people to innovate.
Thank you, Kiran. Let me now shift gears and introduce Professor Arvind Panagaria, who is a professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University in the US. He served as the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog from 2015-2017 in the rank of a cabinet minister. During this tenure, he also served as India's G20 Sherpa. So we actually have two G20 Sherpas in this. I think, Montek, you must have been his immediate predecessor as a G20 Sherpa. So we're really privileged to have two G20 Sherpas in this discussion. Of course, he led the Indian teams that negotiated the G20 communiques. He was also awarded the Padma Bhushan in 2012. He was chief economist at the Asian Development Bank and was on the faculty of the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland. Professor Panagaria has authored more than 15 books. His book, India, the Emerging Giant, was listed as a top pick of 2008 by The Economist magazine. He received his PhD in economics from Princeton University, I think just 2 years after I did. So we were together, so we've known each other since the mid-1970s because we were there together in the economics department at Princeton and have been friends and colleagues ever since. So, Arvind, partly going on from Kiran's wonderful exposition on the issue of innovation and R&D, I do think that it has a connection to international trade. Naushad has a full chapter in international trade. He's been a proponent of a more open economy and is also critical of our withdrawal from RCEP. He's gone on to propose in quotes, let us set ourselves a project. In 10 years, every Indian company must either be able to compete with the best in the world or does not deserve to exist. Your overall views, I would like, on prospects for returning to a more open trade stance, given the ongoing trends in the global economy. Perhaps I'll follow up with another connected question once you address this one.
Okay, thank you, Rakesh. Well, let me also join Kiran and you in expressing my great appreciation of the fantastic book that Naushad has written. Like you, I also wondered, where did he find the time? My full-time job is to write books and articles, and I exactly know how long it takes. So like Prime Minister Modi, he must not sleep. But I've often thought that India's development problem could be solved if we had another half dozen Naushads sitting in CII. So congratulations, Naushad. So there is definitely direct connection, in fact, Rakesh, to what you were just discussing with Kiran, why the industry doesn't innovate. And Kiran said, well, if there are these other profit opportunities, why would I innovate? And hidden behind that actually is a long-standing history, which is how, the way we ran the economy for almost half century, where you provided protection against imports on demand. Anything that was domestically not available, and you said, well, I want to produce this, I want to supply this. The government will immediately stop the import of that product. It was protection provided on demand. And then there was licensing, which also restricted the domestic entry. And so the impact of that was that there was no competition. Anybody who managed to enter the market actually became profitable. And that, I think across the board has impacted the psyche, not just of the bureaucrats, politicians, and so forth, but also the entrepreneurs. The first, when there is a problem, the first place where the entrepreneurs look is the government. What can the government do for me? So specifically to the question, the 10-year project that Naushad proposes, Naushad is very well-intentioned businessman, and so even though he endorses generally an open trade environment, he wishes to do this experiment. But first, let me point to a danger that sort of experiment brings with it. When you provide protection, first of all, when you say that it is 10-year protection, it's not very credible because from history, the entrepreneurs know that once we get our foot in, we will actually, be able to prolong this protection for much longer. But let us say, even if actually we could credibly commit for 10 years, that protection, even for 10 years, would not bring innovation. There will be firms, entrepreneurs who would actually see an opportunity that, look, for 10 years, I got a good deal. And I will continue to produce with my substandard processes, substandard products. I have a protected market here. And for 10 years, I'll make profits, enjoy it while the going is good. And 10 years later, when protection is lifted, I'll exit. And so there is no guarantee actually at all that even a credible commitment to protection for 10 years is going to produce efficient suppliers who would then survive after 10 years. So there is a danger. But even then, I'm willing to go along, play along with Naushad. But I have one condition, that if you would take that risk, then let us also see if the industry is serious. And let's apply this condition at least to the firms which have enjoyed for the last 25 years protection of 25% or more. Let us first see if the industry agrees to lifting protection in sectors where for 25 years there has been a protective tariff of 25% or more. If they say yes, we are okay with it, I'll go with Naushad's recommendation of doing another experiment for the next 10 years.
Thank you. Let me just follow up with that. There's a contrary view to open trade, which is Associate Donny Roderick, which Naushad refers to, where the claim is that countries that managed to leverage globalization, such as China and Vietnam, employed a mixed strategy of export promotion and variety of policies that violate current trade rules. Subsidies, domestic content requirements, investment regulations, and etc. and other input barriers were critical to the creation of new higher value industries. And then, of course, he says countries that rely on free trade alone, Mexico comes to mind, have languished. Now, would one put the new PLI scheme in a similar category? Also, everything we were talking about a minute ago, that the PLI scheme is going to provide for, I think, for 5 years, certain subsidies to industries under certain conditions, and whether this is similar to the kind of thing that Donny Roderick is talking about.
Answer to the last point is straightforward, that yes, that is the motivation, and it does fall in that sort of category. The question really is whether Donny Roderick is right. So first, let me say, to everybody here more broadly about the chapter on international trade, like in the rest of the book, Naushad has read very widely, and he really reads scholars on both sides, and he certainly then sorts out the views, and it is very nicely done in the book. To the specific question now, what Donny is arguing there, it's an old argument really. Donny is much later. We have Robert Wade, who made exactly the same argument before him. This was in 1990, so almost 30 years ago. And to that, actually, at that time, Ian Little had replied very cogently. And I'll come to that. Now, this interventionist model really, where you do industrial targeting, provide protection temporarily, and so forth, comes from examples taken out of South Korea. The first point to note about South Korea is that South Korea did not begin its industrial policy until about 1973. Its HCI drive, the heavy and chemical industries drive, doesn't start till about 1973. Prior to that, there is a whole decade, 1963 to 1973, when there is no industrial targeting. They did protect something like fertilizer and petrochemicals, which everybody does, but not the rest of the industries. The incentives were all neutral, whether they were export oriented or protection, but these were largely neutral. And during this period, a whole decade, Korea grew about 9.1%. And one example, favorite example I give, that there was no targeting being done during this 10-year period, is one of the leading exports that emerged in South Korea at that time. It was the human hair, wigs. If you go back, look at the composition of exports in 1963, human hair is simply not present in the basket. And by the end of this period, 10% of South Korea's exports are human hair. So no targeting was done, and they grew actually at 9.1%. During the decade that followed, 1974 to 1982, this is the targeting decade. Growth rate actually declined to 6.9%. So that's my first point. That now a broader point, of course, here is that every country that succeeds or fails intervenes. There is not a country, Hong Kong is probably the purest example, and I'll mention that again later. But nature of the government is to intervene. And So whether the countries failed or succeeded, countries have intervened. Question really is that can we connect the interventions to the higher growth, or it happened in spite of the intervention? That really is the key question. And that's where I think, all the earlier writers, including Robert Wade also, as well as Danny Roderick, have failed to kind of make that connection. When Robert Wade wrote about this, and he said that, Korea actually grew at a pretty high growth rate, and it intervened. And to say that intervention did not contribute positively would mean that absent the interventions, Korea would have grown even faster. And that's simply not credible. To that, Ian Little replied, said that, why does Mr. Wade think that that is not credible? In fact, all the other three Asian tigers, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, intervened less. And all three of them grew faster than South Korea. So the counterfactual that Korea would have also grown faster is completely credible. That was his response. And so that's the second point. Third point is that everybody who says that, oh, intervention worked here and intervention worked there, makes the claim. Danny Roderick writes sort of, a book saying, many recipes to development, many recipes. But what he does there is to describe what happened. So ex post, we know that, these interventions happened and the countries grew rapidly. But can somebody actually give actual model, that, okay, these are the 10 things of intervention that you should do, and these are the 20 things you should not do. But nobody has done that. And your own teacher, by the way, or maybe he was your teacher at Yale, the Yale economist, Gus Rennis, he wrote about, commented once on Robert Wade. He said, Robert Wade in the book in Taiwan describes ex post what the government did. And then he goes on talking about how Taiwan acted strategically. The government acted strategically. So Gus Rennis says that, Wade's governing markets describes government interventions in Taiwan ex post, but I could find no primer on just how to act strategically. What is the ICP? I mean, you got to be able to tell us. Just describing that, this happened, and therefore, just doesn't really cut it. Now, finally, Mexico. For the record, I should note that it was actually Danny Roderick who was one of the foremost supporters of opening of NAFTA, that this will actually bring great gains to Mexico. And it was people like Jagdish Bhagwati and yours truly who were on the opposite side saying that this is discriminatory liberalization. This is not the kind of, non-discriminatory liberalization which produced successes in East Asia. So now, of course, that Mexico has not succeeded, that has become his example of free trade failing. Now, every single thing that Danny says there, domestic content requirements, subsidies, this, that, and the other, was tried by Mexico before it opened up. I mean, if you go back to the history of 1980s and 1970s, all these interventions were done by Mexico, and it's because those things failed that Mexico then said, well, I'm going to try NAFTA. So, but if anybody has a recipe to make a success out of Mexico, I would like to hear. I'd like to know it myself. But certainly, whatever Danny has suggested here for the success of Mexico, Mexico had tried already, and Danny knows that history also. But like a contrarian, Danny, and including being contrarian to himself, because he was the one who first actually was supporting NAFTA at the time of negotiation. But the fact is that nobody has produced, Latin America is not a place where I look for lessons, I must say, because absolutely nothing has succeeded in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. I had another question for you. We don't have much time on that, on higher education, but if there's time later, I'll come back to you. I do hope, Arvind, that you will keep lending your strong voice along with Naushad from the other side being industry, on getting our country to open more and reverse some of the changes that have taken place in the last many years, which and also made me talk about the exchange rate, which I didn't have time to ask you about actually. Let me turn to Montek, last panelist. Of course, also he was G20 Sherpa for India. He's a distinguished fellow at CSEP and has been, of course, a notable figure in Indian economic reforms from the early 1980s onwards. He has, of course, previously served as Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of India, Finance Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, and also as the first Director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. He has written extensively on various aspects of development economics and is a recipient of the Padma Vibhushan, India's second highest civilian award for public service. He's the author of a recent book, Backstage, The Story Behind India's High Growth Years. It's published a couple of years ago. So actually, Montek, I think this is a very good segue to you, the last discussion that with Arvind, that is this issue of knowing what the government, knowing what to do to promote growth, comes back to some extent to the issue of state capacity. Naushad writes a lot about state capacity and is generally critical of the lack of state capacity in India. And this leads him to propose private sector solutions to most issues, perhaps even more than what is practiced in Western capitalist countries. Do you think that we can aspire to build better state capacity to do things that the state must do, and of course, eschew what it shouldn't? I have another question for you. Once you, of course, you are free to speak on whatever you want to speak on Naushad's book.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Rakesh. And let me join both Kiran and Arvind in congratulating Naushad on this. I mean, it sounds as if I'm just saying something trite, but it really is a fascinating book. It's different from the kind of books that economists write, because those are always kind of, if you like, configured around a particular way of defining the problem. And I thought this was really fascinating because, you know, it sort of takes certain themes and then within those themes, it just kind of brings out a lot of richness of experience, which I personally found really very good. You know, somewhere in the book he mentions that when Naushad, when you were chairman of CII, you maintained a daily diary. And quite honestly, I wish you would just publish that, at least for your friends. I mean, I'd be fascinated to, because that would have a sense of the sequence of events, knowing what the context was, which is a different way of cutting it. And honestly, if you really did maintain a daily diary, you can always redact. I think that's the phrase they use. Redact things that you think are too insulting, but leave the rest of it in. The book is actually quite sort of willing. Your book is quite willing to criticize in many areas. So, I mean, you obviously have the instinct of being able to say interesting things, even if they end up being a little controversial. But I seriously suggest that you pull out that diary, do some minimal redacting, and just print the whole thing and share it with your friends. In fact, Rakesh, you should offer from CSEP to do a little kind of Zoom on that particular version. It would be a lot of fun. Now, coming back to this, Rakesh, you really, I mean, fascinating discussion with Arvind. And I want to join what you said, that, I mean, it's very important for Arvind to remain vocal, putting forward his case on the openness of trade. I mean, I occasionally invoke his name to indicate that, look, it's not just people outside the government, but even guys whom the government themselves had brought in who recommended that this be done. I don't do it too often because I don't want him to lose credibility with the government, but I think it is interesting that, you know, I think the big difference between 1991 and now is that in 1991, there was a global consensus on what to do. We were the only odd guys out not doing it. So actually, it was relatively easy to say, listen, I mean, just wake up and smell the coffee. And this is the right thing to do. And slowly you kind of were able to get it across. Of course, the fact that we had as finance minister someone who had done his own thesis in trade theory made a big difference, Manmohan Singh. But the interesting thing is today that consensus has more or less disappeared. And not just in economics, it's also disappeared in what is the nature of liberal democracy, what is the role of elites. And that's true in Europe, that's true in America, it's probably true here also. So I think these ideas are now being picked up and discussed by people in a world in which social media has empowered everybody. So it's very difficult to know what is an expert view and what is just a view that is circulating around on WhatsApp. And I mean, Naushad in a very balanced way kind of puts Abhijit and Danny Roderick on one side and then puts Arvind on the other side. And he himself, I thought he gives a slight sense of being more on Arvind's side, but while genuflecting to the Danny Roderick and Abhijit side, saying, well, they also have a point. I would have thought these are issues that we really need to discuss much more thoroughly in India. Now, when you talk about state capacity, we don't have discussions. I mean, I don't know what's going on in government now, of course, but I don't get the sense that these issues are being thrashed out either in government or in industry. I mean, I realize that in public, industry has always applauded whatever the government does. And quite honestly, I can understand that. Whatever sensible things the industry wants to say to government, it does privately, not by making public statements. I have no idea. But from what Naushad says, I get the sense that he is actually in industry itself a bit of a lone voice. It may be, and I mean, I'd really like to hear Naushad tell me that it's really true that a lot of his colleagues actually agree with him. They just don't say it, and I would understand that. But that's somehow not the impression I get. I think most of them buy the argument now associated with Danny Roderick that this is the way successful countries have operated. Of course, at the back of your mind is always this issue that you've got to succeed in exports. I mean, the big thing about Korea was that they never had any doubt that the criterion of success would be exports. Our problem is the criterion of success is import substitution. I mean, if somebody were to say, we are pushing Atmanirbhar because we want to become, if you like, the Vishwa gurus on vaccines for the world. And the test of that is that today only 2 out of 5 internationally recognized vaccines are being produced in India. In 5 years, 4 out of 5 will be produced in India, and we will be exporting them to the world. If that was the thrust, I think we might make progress. But the thrust is that, a short while ago, we were highly dependent. We had to import masks. Now we are making masks ourselves. Now, given that masks are a pretty low technology product and we have a large population, we have a comparative advantage in producing masks. It's good that we are producing it, but that's really not a real sign of success. I do think that, Naushad had told me earlier, and I've mentioned it in my book also, the lovely story that, after the liberalization in 1991, he and his brother sat down and said, look, what are the products which we would be competitive in if inputs were available duty-free at world prices? And they came to the conclusion that only 50% of the products they produce, they would be competitive in. But then they decided we're not going to produce the other products and we're going to produce these, and then have put themselves targets that, you go from 10% exports to 20% exports, etc. And I was so impressed by this when he first told me that, the person I play golf with is a small scale guy, not one of these big industries. But I kept telling him that, listen, how much do you export? And it was at that time less than 10%. So I said, you should set a target and try and get to it. And I'm happy to tell you that the fellow actually did set targets, and he's now exporting 35 to 40%. So this proposition that the mindset change within industry can make a big difference is terrific. Of course, since I don't know enough about it, uh, I, I mean, we need more books like Naushad's, and we need people to actually realize that when people take up a challenge, I mean, as Naushad has done and Kiran has done and others too, that they're actually able to succeed in a competitive way. We need a lot more examples of this than we actually have, and we're not publicizing them. And I would have thought Indian industry as a group would start celebrating those who actually managed to do this. Naushad has a slightly misleading graph, if I may, just to prove that I actually read the book, Naushad, because it's very easy to praise everything, but if you say something that you think is critical, then it really proves you've read it. I think you mentioned the fact that trade as a ratio to GDP is higher in India than China. But that's dominantly because of software, the service exports, which actually includes remittances. If you just went by trade as a percent of GDP, it's true that we've improved, and certainly America has no example because they're not actually oriented to product trade and product exports that much. But I think in our case, that figure which shows us way ahead of China as a ratio of GDP is slightly misleading. But if you cut that out and you just say that, look, which are the Indian industries that have really succeeded, it would be quite an interesting story to tell. I mentioned this also because we're currently going through what I think is going to be a highly disruptive system change in the country, pushed by two factors. One is what Kiran herself mentioned, which is the whole digitalization, where, thanks to people like Nandan Nilekani and so on, we managed to get the framework laid. The framework is actually laid in the previous government, but this government has built on it very rapidly. So it's actually a multi-government achievement, and it is significant. What has happened and what could happen. So the whole digitalization area is one. The other is, if we actually rise to the challenge of meeting climate change, quite frankly, we're going to have a radical transformation of our energy sector, most of the energy using stuff, and certainly the transport sector. I mean, the structural change in Indian industry is going to be, just look at automobiles. Automobiles think of themselves as the kingpins of Indian industry. That's because they believe that the automobile industry, led the industrialization change in the United States, and therefore they're going to do the. In a way, Kiran sort of implied that when she said we need so many million automobiles, although, mind you, with digitalization and sort of the ride sharing, we may not need that many cars, but whatever it is. The mere fact that you go from the internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle is going to transform industry in the sense that the number of components that an electrical vehicle needs is much, much smaller than something that has an internal combustion engine. So all these guys who are currently this very vibrant, booming component manufacturing industry, somebody ought to read them a little bit of the future and say that, look, if we're really going to achieve 100% of automotive sale is going to be EV by, let us say, 2050, which is only 30 years from now, then quite frankly, all the guys manufacturing engine components have a 30-year life. And these are all manufacturers, and many of whom have children who are 10 years old. Do they realize that their 10-year-old kid is not going to be running an automotive component manufacturing unit? So if they want to actually gift him a sensible industry, they better change to something else, producing batteries or, refurbishing batteries or something of that kind. So I think we don't have enough of a focus on what are these changes and how are we going to become competitive in the light of these disruptive changes. Not a question of just doing efficiently what you're doing now, but get into the new areas that are coming up and be efficient there. Big challenge. And I think a lot of what Naushad says about how industry thinks, I mean, I just hope that these guys read his book and say, hey, I better do some thinking along those lines. Now, much the same thing is true of government, because government is singularly incapable of doing what people call whole of the system thinking. I mean, let's just look at the climate change business. Historically, climate change has been discussed in the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, the UNFCCC, 195 countries, etc. It's dominated by the Ministry of Environment, which historically used to look at things like forests and that sort of stuff. And it's supported by the Ministry of External Affairs, which is a whole bunch of bureaucrats. Now, elsewhere, the lead is being taken by a climate change negotiator who's actually empowered by whatever the president or the prime minister or something to bring on board the different ministries that are relevant. And in India, I mean, climate change really means the energy sector. One elementary thing, if we're going to achieve what Mr. Modi has, I think, very sensibly announced, that is, we are going to go net zero by 2070. I mean, most of his team was strongly opposed to that. So I was delighted that he actually said they were going net zero by 2070. Now, the implication of net zero by 2070 is that certainly coal-fired power stations should just get out of the Indian reality by 2050. I mean, they should just be retired. Since all these things have a 40-year life, it also means that other than the coal power station currently under construction, we should announce that we're not going to build any more. And the other side of this is that Coal India should become a miner of lithium and these kinds of things rather than coal, because coal is a dead industry. Nobody is willing to say that. And I mean, I don't know whether industry is doing some of this thinking. I mean, the interesting thing is that unlike in the past, from the corporate sector, you've got some pretty good responses. I mean, there's Mukesh saying that, look, I'm getting into green hydrogen and things like that. Adani's are also getting into green energy. So the corporate guys are acting quite a bit. I don't know whether our energy corporates are doing the same thing. I mean, for example, Coal India, are they moving from, do they have an internal plan that, you know, in 30 years' time, there aren't going to be that many coal mines that will be operating? So what are we going to do? I mean, if we're going to go down the solar and wind energy route, take solar. It comes back to trade, because I think Arvind should take a look at this, because in this budget, one of the things we've raised customs duty on is solar cells. So, you know, now it's very interesting that at the moment, since we're forcing people to buy solar energy as a kind of directed thing to get the thing going, the price doesn't matter so much because, you know, the electricity will get sold. But if you're getting into a competitive market, then we cannot be sort of slapping on tariffs on solar cells, making these things more expensive. And the associate point is that this is an area where technology is going to change very dramatically, because the whole bloody world is working on it. So are we going to end up with the sort of ambassador car, Fiat car syndrome? That is, some guy starts producing a solar cell and then erects walls around it on Atmanirbhar grounds, even though other people are producing solar cells that are 3 times more efficient. So I think, frankly, it's going to be a lot of fun. And I mean, Rakesh, you're running a research institution, so you better plan research around this. Arvind, you're a guru in this area, so keep a watchful eye open on India, and maybe those of your Indian students who are coming back to sort of keep guiding this direction. And Naushad, maybe trigger some of your colleagues, and indeed Kiran also, although you're not in energy, but you know you're very much that. By the way, Kiran, on digitalization, maybe I'm burbling a bit too much, but you just stimulated me so much. You know, on digitalization, on the one hand, there's this tremendous enthusiasm that this will be a hugely disruptive in a Schumpeterian sense of a good thing, new changes, etc. On the other hand, there is this view that digitalization is creating so much power on the part of the big guys who mine your data, that the whole idea that markets lead to rational allocations in the light of consumer decision making is totally undermined. That, of course, is what Leena Khan, in the new FTC commissioner, is doing in India, saying all these guys, you know, they may think that they're serving consumers, but actually they're brainwashing consumers to think they're being served. So it's a very subtle set of points. And we could have exactly the same problems coming up in India. And it will become a classic big guys versus little guys thing. That the big retailers, I don't mean foreign retailers, actually, it's interesting because it's the Indian retailers, the Mukesh and all these guys, who want to use this in order to bypass the distribution stream and reach the Kirana store directly. And already the guys who are being bypassed, all the middlemen, same problem that you have with farm laws. They're saying, look here, the consumer may be getting a little bit more, but my livelihood is at stake. Is this a good thing? It kind of reminds me of, I mean, Rahul Bajaj used to say that consumer interest is not the same thing as national interest. Now that is actually in current legal theory, a well-established proposition. It's what they call the Louis Brandeis view on antitrust activity. So we're getting into intellectual areas where there's a lot of ferment. Anyway, I apologize for going on. The main thing is I really enjoyed the book, Naushad, and congratulations. And do publish your handwritten, your day-to-day, day-by-day diary, which you mentioned.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you. We have just a few questions from the audience. One is a very important one, which is Naushad, Arvind, Kiran, whoever, the issue of doesn't the issue of language, does that not put a lot of constraint on scientific and technical education in the country, given that there are so many different languages and not everyone is well versed in English as they grow up? Naushad, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, I talk a little bit about this in the book too, actually. And I think our great strength is actually our prowess in English, especially when it comes to science and technology. Because if you look around the world, English is the language of science and technology in every country, including in Europe and through much of Asia. It's actually a big advantage that we have in actually engaging with the world in English. It may not be politically correct to think in those terms, but it's sort of factual. It's
so the issue, Naushad, that is being posed is the opposite. That is that, yes, of course, that we have a large number because we are a large country who speak English and therefore it's an advantage. But the majority of population grows up in their own language, and therefore, and there are not enough textbooks, etc., in their own languages.
So, so actually an engagement, in school education, could we do a better job with regional language training? Almost surely so. Could we do a better job with bilingual education? Actually, that's what we end up doing, because we have very often, even English medium schools, the explanations in the textbooks will be in English, and the class teacher will explain subjects and answer questions and so on in the local language. So you have this sort of combination of that ends up delivering bilingual education. I think it actually is quite an effective combination for our engagement with the world, certainly when it comes to innovation. I mean, if we're talking beyond that, it's different. But I think if we're talking about innovation and sort of global innovation, I think English is actually a very good platform to build that innovation mindset around.
Arvind, do you want to comment on that?
It's a very, wide issue, but what I have often felt is that, look, there were countries like South Korea, Japan, for which English was not the first language. They've done very well. Now China. The language barrier can be overcome. I don't think it is insurmountable. And this also cuts the other way, that which goes a little bit opposite of what Naushad was saying, that we think that somehow English gave us a huge advantage. But look, countries that are doing well did very well. Taiwan, Korea, Hong Kong, now China. They caught up. So at the end of the day, I mean, personally, I personally feel that along with English came the socialism, which really kind of hurt India so badly. I mean, that's a separate subject, but so I don't think this is really a big barrier. When you want to do science, you learn English, and you can draw on those books. So in that sense, I could sort of agree with Naushad.
I would like to add, I would just like to say that, look, I think English is the language of science and engineering, mathematics to a very large extent. And if you think about the fact that our software industry in India is where it is and dominates the world, is largely because of the English education or the digital language that happens to be English, which is what makes us very, very strong. So from that point of view, I think English has helped us in a very big way. And I can tell you that in all our labs, or even in the software centers, people will talk in a different language, but they all speak the language, the digital language and the language of science, which is English. They write in English, they write, they do all their research in English. So I think it cuts both ways. I think English is a big help for a country like India.
Thank you. I'll end with one large question posed to all of you. In the chapter on democratic politics, chapter 11, Naushad discusses the question whether there's too much democracy is in the way of India's growth. The context is that medical economies of South Korea, Taiwan, and most recently China have all been authoritarian during their high rapid growth phases. So in the 3 decades of top policy making, Montek and Naushad, Kiran, do you think that's an issue? Arvind, of course. Sorry. Arvind, you want to start off?
Okay, I'll go first. Well, first of all, I don't think democracy is ever in the way. And our own experience does show that to a considerable degree, that when good policies got adopted, the same economy, which was performing at 3 to 4%, has now shifted to between 7 and 8. So that's a pretty actually solid example there. But I do feel one aspect of the Indian democracy which has handicapped us, and that was beginning of the democracy, which was combined simultaneously with socialism. I really think that this has had very long-term effects, because in the psyche of the bureaucrats, psyche of the politicians, psyche of the journalists, psyche of the intellectuals, this ideology kind of got embedded, and there is inheritance in this. The new IAS officers that come in learn from the old IAS officers. new politicians that come in learn from the old politicians. Economists who actually learned their economics in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they then reproduce themselves in the colleges and all. So this kind of socialist ideology, though much reduced, has still not left us. And this is where I see it continues to express itself, both in terms of slowing down of the reform process, privatization, for example, doesn't happen so rapidly. Policies don't get adopted so rapidly. Even, if you look back 20 years after the reforms had already been kicked off, we get largely a socialist legislation, which is Land Acquisition Act, largely another socialist legislation, which is the Right to Education Act. And we revert to protectionism yet again. And the same terminology that we used to use, PMP, the phased manufacturing program, the domestic availability kind of saying that, no exemption on the tariff rates, so another 300 products go back to 7.5% tariffs. I think somehow this ideology so deeply got embedded, and along all, ultimately most parties did also come out of the Congress party, so which had that ideology embedded, So that, I think, that aspect of democracy has hurt India, whereas, if it was authoritarian, China started the same way, heavy industry and everything, and communism at that. But comes along Deng Xiaoping, authoritarian, bang, he changes it, and then he can't be questioned. But in a democracy, that questioning is very much there for the good, but at the same time, its mixture with socialism has been a bit deadly.
Monte?
Well, yeah, I would probably put a little less emphasis on the pervasive role of socialism as an ideology. But I do think that what has happened is that today our democracy is actually highly vulnerable to extreme populism. I mean, you look at the Punjab elections that are going on. I mean, what is being said is virtually guaranteed to make the Punjab state economy go steadily downhill until the state government is busted. And it's true of all parties now. And I mean, that's going to be the real issue. I mean, the test of it all is that will this get corrected because we hit a crisis that makes people realize that you can't do this? Otherwise, the way to win an election is thought to be give any number of freebies that you want. And one view would be that yes, you give a lot of freebies, but you still observe some fiscal discipline. But actually what happens is when you're giving all these freebies, then the state doesn't do what you want it to do, which is health and education. And that's a serious problem. Now, maybe this could get altered if there's more power in the hands of the state. But that cuts against this notion that to hold the country together, you need a strong center. There's a very strong kind of belief which spans both the right and the left. It's not a particularly socialist idea. So it's a tough question. I don't have an answer. But we will have to wait to see how it works.
Kiran?
Well, I for one believe that authoritarianism never yields innovation for sure. So I just feel that you've got to have a very democratic, set of tenets that allow you to question. You have to have this dissent. And that's what really builds a very, very strong and durable culture and a durable economy at that. So I, for one, believe that you cannot be thinking that economic growth is tied to authoritarianism more than a free democratic system. And I agree with Montek. I think you're clearly seeing that very liberal states with very high levels of democracy are doing very well. I mean, you look at a state like Karnataka, where of course we have a very liberal and democratic culture, which actually is very conducive for growth and innovation. So I, for one, believe that you can't tie economic growth to an authoritarian kind of system.
Thank you, Kiran. So Naushad, you have the last word. Before you do that, one commentator on the chat box says, "Dear Naushad, superb. Your book should be made mandatory reading for all our civil service studies and exams."
Well, anyway, thank you for the comment. So Rakesh, you've done a wonderful job of reading my book and promoting it as well. And as you know, in the last chapter, in that same section on too much democracy, I come out with a clear view. So let me start by saying that I'm entirely in Kiran's camp, right? That I think democracy is hugely powerful as a framework for innovation. There was a wonderful piece written in Research Policy, 28 years ago by Richard Nelson, Arvind's colleague at Columbia.
And my teacher at Yale.
And your teacher here, where he talks about capitalism being an engine of progress. And he was talking actually about the US system versus the Soviet system. And he talks about why the US system was much more powerful, because he says that even though capitalism is a more inefficient system, it actually ends up being a more powerful system, because you end up with much more of variation and experimentation that gets thrown up. And because of that experimentation, then selected by the market, you end up with a more powerful solution and more innovation that's productive at the end of the day. But I hesitate to, for someone who's gone through my book and has read 100,000 words, I hesitate to say you should read 2,000 more. But in December, I wrote a two-part article in Business Standard specifically on this topic, on the role of inclusive politics as a framework and as a foundation for inclusive economics, and using another book that you can read about in the article, and the argument really is that in post-1991, our politics tended to fragment, and we didn't have a dominant political party. Our most reformist government, 1991 to 96, we should remind ourselves, was a minority government for the entire 5 years that it was in office. It put through the most transformative reforms as a minority government. Second, that as politics fragmented, institutions gained greater authority and power. The Election Commission of India under Session became much more stronger independent voice. The Supreme Court became much more divergent from the prevailing views of the government. The president stopped being a complete rubber stamp and started pushing things back to the government from time to time. All of these institutions really came to the fore for a period of time as a result of this fragmented politics. So the inclusive politics, in many ways, we also had very venal regional parties that became powerful. But the net result, it seems to me, was that you had this fragmented politics leading to much more inclusive politics, and the inclusive politics led to more rapid growth. And I think since 2017, as we've returned to more and more of a dominant political party, as we had with the Congress before up to around 1990, I think that return to a much more dominant politics dominated by one party is leading also then to less institutional independence, and less institutional independence is leading then to poorer economic outcomes. I don't think these things are unconnected. So that's really where I come out on in those two articles. So I would argue strongly in favor of democracy and greater democracy as a way of underpinning greater economic success. Last comment, if I may, please. I think these are wonderful issues and wonderful topics for us to talk about. And I completely agree with Montek. We need to talk about them in government, but we need to talk about them more widely too. We need to talk about them. We do talk about them some in industry, but we need to talk about them much more widely in general in terms of public debate. These are great issues for us to debate. And if we can foster more of this discussion, it seems to me that we'll get much further along this path to leadership. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Naushad, first, for giving us the opportunity of launching your book. Thank you, Kiran, for giving your time, even though you're actually away from home. Thank you, Arvind, for waking up so early in the morning and being so clear-headed despite the early hour. And thank you, Montek, for, as always, for being with us and contributing. Finally, I must thank my team, Zahra Kazmi, who's the head of communications, Ishita, who's organizers, Trishna, Shishir, and Ganesh Shivamani for organizing and making this event possible. So I think I've only gone 6 minutes over time, which is, I think, the best we've done in one of these webinars. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to, of course, all the participants who have logged on to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rakesh. Bye, everybody. Bye,
Thank you, Rakesh. Thank you.